Today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show, JCPS, in an attempt to continue to try to solve its transportation problems, is now asking for the legislature to step in and allow people who cannot clearly speak English to pass the test and become bus drivers in order to help them fill their gap. We'll go into that idea and how awful it obviously is. And speaking of JCPS, the lawmakers in the state legislature, they wrapped up their JCPS Task Force, and its findings come back with something that honestly, if you're JCPS, if you're the liberals in this state, you should be seizing on to point out that Republicans are just awful and horrible and can't solve anybody's problems, and they talk a lot, but they don't get anything done. And unfortunately, even though I'm a Republican myself, what they did here definitely points to that. So we'll dig into that as well. Also, we'll have the Senate race for McConnell's spot. 2026 is heating up. We've had a slew of websites that have been saved, that people have bought up the domains to, and also we're already seeing some polling going out, trying to see who should be positioned where, trying to see name ID, whether or not people would vote for somebody in the Senate. That is all beginning already. And it's still, 2 years away from that actual election, the primary about a year and a half away. So we'll be digging into that. We'll have all that and more today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Please make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe. Make sure if you're listening to the show on a podcasting platform where you can leave a review, please do so. But without further ado, let's dig down into it. So JCPS has had a lot of busing woes. We've talked about how in past years, if you've listened to the show for any length of time, we know that when school started about a year and a half ago or so, they weren't getting kids home till 9 o'clock at night. They actually had to cancel school for several days because they couldn't figure out how to get kids to class. They couldn't figure out how to, they'd use software to set up these new routes, and then they didn't have their bus drivers practice those routes beforehand. And surprise, surprise, the bus drivers were like, oh, these routes don't work. They have me going the wrong way down one way. They have me crossing, 6 lanes of traffic during busy morning traffic. I'm not going to be able to pull that off. And it was very frustrating for a lot of people. And this led to many issues with, like I said, JCPS shutting down, but also bus drivers going on a pseudo strike. Of course, they're not allowed to actually organize a strike, but they did like a sick out of sorts, and a list of demands was handed out. But, it's funny, what wasn't on those demands was more pay. What was on the demands were things like children needed to behave better. Children needed to be under control. They needed to be, bus drivers needed to be able to control their own buses. Well, JCPS didn't really bother trying to fix any of that. Now, the legislature did come in and pass a few laws to kind of help bus drivers out on that side of things. But JCPS, that wasn't an option for them. They said, no, we can't get these kids under control. The thing that the bus drivers are actually asking us to do. We can't give them time to practice this routes. Instead, we're going to try to solve this problem in other ways. And the way they first have been trying to solve their transportation issue was they decided they were going to go ahead and try to reduce down their routes a little bit, reduce down their start times. They used to have like 5 start times, 6 start times. Now they have 3, but the latest start time is so late in the day. It's like at 9:30 a.m. is when their first school starts, and then they go obviously later into the afternoon. But they're like, this is one of our options. The other thing they started to do was to pay the parents of kids to actually take their own children to school, which is a very interesting idea, to pay you to drive your own child. So if they turned around and they said that, look, we can't provide busing to this area, what we're going to do instead is pay you to drive your own children. What was interesting about that idea is that they were offering to pay families $5 a day in order to drive their kids to school, or $10 a day, with the higher amount going to people who qualified for free or reduced lunch, which is a curious proposal only because you would think the cost to get, for lack of a better term here, poor kids and not poor kids to school is the same for the district, because every kid fills up a seat on the bus. The bus drivers all get paid the same. Buses driving the same amount of mileage use up generally the same costs and expenses. It doesn't matter whether you're driving through lower income housing or mansions. Really, they cost the same, but for some reason the school decided to go ahead and give a $10 fee to those parents whose were of poor parents to take their kids to school, because somehow they're incurring more costs than richer, quote unquote, parents. I don't know. It didn't make much sense. And they were paid out more than $2 million in just a few months in order to drive their own children to school. So that was one way they're trying to solve it. Well, they've cooked up another way. They're now asking the legislature to make the tests that the drivers of school buses have to go through, the bus driver CDL tests, whatever it may be, to make it where people who have English as a second language, that they could go ahead and be able to take the test in different languages, be able to get accommodations for them. And, honestly, who could see this as a bad idea? Sure, yeah. If you can't take a driver's test in English, how are you going to communicate with the majority of your students that speak English? Now, granted, I'm sure there's a good amount of students that don't understand English going to JCPS. That's part of the problem, is that we do have so many students who have English as a second language because, of course, back in the day, we used to believe in to be assimilated. We expect them to assimilate to our culture, to our language, to our way of doing things if you want to come into our country. But we don't really do that anymore. Instead, we enable individuals to continue to not know one language because, what unites a country like not being able to communicate with each other? But anyways, putting that to the side. And so while I'm sure there are students who don't speak English, the fact of the matter is that still, despite Biden's best efforts, the majority of students in Louisville still speak English and do not understand other languages. So you run into a real problem here if you can't take the test in English. How are you going to communicate with children in English? Remember, the reason why the bus drivers did a sick out was because they couldn't control their children. And so rather than providing the bus drivers the tools they need to get control of their buses, allowing them to kick people off their bus, allowing them to establish who can ride or not, the school district has instead requested lawmakers allow them to hire people who can't communicate with the bad kids. After all, how can you complain about your children being unruly if you can't communicate with them anyways? If they're being verbally abusive to the bus driver, we won't solve the problem by getting the children under control. No, we'll solve the problem by getting bus drivers that don't understand the verbal abuse. What a swell idea. But that's JCPS's best choice here at how do I fix this problem? This is what they're coming up with. Obviously, it's because, holding children accountable, holding parents accountable, having there be real consequences, that's not an option available to them. That's not a place they will go. But if you're looking for other people within our government to maybe give them a solution to fix this JCPS problem, you would be mistaken. You see, recognizing what an absolute tire fire JCPS is, our state legislature this past session put together a JCPS Task Force that was tasked with looking at options for how do we solve the abysmal behavior of the JCPS district. We have schools in the JCPS district that less than 10% of the kids can read, do math, do science. Entire schools that are objectively failing in any sense of the word. Behavior issues, chronic absenteeism. It's a tire fire. It's going down the toilet. And so the legislature is recognizing this, said, you know what, we need to put together a task force to take a look at all these issues and come out with recommendations, because if JCPS can't fix them, we are going to. We as a state give them, $4,000 or $5,000 or so a year because they have the SEEK formula, but then they also have the transportation fund as well as a few other things. So we're giving them $5,000, maybe even $6,000 or so a year we have a say here. We can step in and say how they're going to right this ship. And so they formed this committee. Well, the committee has come out with their recommendations, and you'll never guess what they've recommended. I'll give you a hint. It's nothing. It's literally nothing. What they have recommended instead is that the committee, the task force, be reformed to continue study through the interim after session in 2025 through till the end of 2025. So to put it another way, this committee was formed in large part because in the year of 2023, JCPS failed to be able to get kids to school and had to cancel school for several days. And the problems have continued to swirl. But that really what created the standout and the conversation amongst people to say, hey, look, this school's a problem. And that started the conversation. 2023. Now we're looking at it being 3 years at the soonest later till the legislature gets anything in place from this task force to fix JCPS. Now, granted, they've passed a few laws. It'd be unfair of me to say they haven't passed a few laws at the state legislature level to help deal with some of these problems, such as some laws regarding bus drivers being able to control their buses better, some laws regarding more funding for transportation, of course, a few laws regarding what can be taught in the classroom, but really it hasn't fixed the overall problem of JCPS underperforming. You know, one of the conversations that was being looked at was breaking up the district of JCPS because they said it's just too big, maybe it needs to be broke up. Now, that is the only change between the task force they've recommended moving forward and the task force we have now, which is that they're going to take looking, according to their findings, they're going to take looking at breaking up the district off the table. So, to get this straight, the legislature Republicans, keep on a Republican, I'm a conservative. They step in, they spend thousands of dollars over the course of the last 7 months or so, ever since session ended, having hearings, hearing from witnesses, getting together, really studying the issue of JCPS and how to fix it. Keep in mind, the legislators on the task force are largely from that area. So, you know, it's not like this is the first time they're encountering JCPS issues. They've recognized that there are JCPS issues. You know, in fact, one of the people in task force, Jason Nemes, he is a representative in both Louisville and Oldham County, and he pointed out that people are leaving Louisville, going to Oldham County because of the school system there. It's just a fact of the matter. So the idea that they're having problems, that isn't new at all. So you'd think going into it, they'd like, okay, these are the solutions we kind of already have. Let's see what tinkering we need to do with them. But apparently that's not what's happened here. Instead, their solution is no solution. Their solution is we need to study it further. Now, this only gives fuel to the JCPS fire here. Their claim of, well, we need more money or we need this or that. We can't fix this easily. It's a multifaceted issue that is more complicated. Now, relatively speaking, what we're talking about when we get into our schools is simple. It's not easy, but it's simple in the sense of kids need to show up to school, and then you need to teach them English, math, reading, science. You teach them those important subjects that they need to learn in order to be functional in society, history. Teach them those core subjects. Then you need to get them back home. And while they're there learning, they need to be learning. That's it. That's your overall task. Now, I know I've extremely simplified it. I'm recognizing the fact that that isn't easy to do. I'm not going to pretend like it's the easiest thing in the world to teach a kid math and reading and everything else all the time and understand they all have their interesting little issues that kids have. I get that. I do. But at the same time, we don't need to necessarily complicate it and overcomplicate the problem here. Something is coming in line between, if kids are struggling at school, it has to do with a few things. One, they're maybe not getting to school. We've seen that with JCPS. Once they get to school, they're not behaving. We've seen that with JCPS. If they are behaving, maybe the teachers are not doing, they're low-quality teachers. A potential possibility. And then they need to be taken home. So that's it. That's like all the categories it could be in. So like I said, you'd think they would have this, but by them coming back saying, we have no suggestions here, we need to study it now for another whole year. So now 2 years we need to study it before we can make any suggestions. All you're telling JCPS is that, well, maybe it is more complicated. I mean, you're literally just reinforcing their ideas about how you don't know what you're talking about when it comes to the school system. And liberals should be, the Democrats and those people who think that the JCPS is just fantastic, doing a great job, and the state needs to leave them alone, they should be celebrating that. Now, it's not the first time our legislature comes back with the default position of we need more study. In fact, a lot of these task force get formed, and then they either perpetuate themselves forever or it's a complete waste of money. I mean, take for an example the Certificate of Need law. Kentucky has one of the most pervasive Certificate of Need laws in the country. No matter where you fall on con laws, Certificate of Need laws, whether they're needed or not needed, important or not important, protect the healthcare industry, protect patients or don't, whatever, it doesn't matter. The important thing is that everybody in the state agrees that it is in its current state, like almost everybody agrees it needs reformed. So they formed a task force to reform it. They spent tens of thousands of taxpayer funds on legislator pay, on pay for support staff, pay for cameramen and video services, pay, of course, for facilities and space. I mean, you got power on, you got these things on, pay for security there. I mean, I remember this wasn't even open meetings that were held several times, but where I pulled this number from is that some of you may remember that I was one of the citizens that filed to impeach Beshear, and they tried to pass a cost bill on to us for 5 or 6 legislators meeting about 3 or 4 times, I think, 4 times, maybe 5 times, 3 or 4, maybe 5 times, deciding on whether or not to move the impeachment petition against Beshear forward. And the bill they tried to stick us with before we went to federal court and got it dismissed was $44,000, about $10,000 a meeting. So if you figure, even if this task force is meeting once monthly and they meet 6 times, 7 times, according to their own math from their own receipts that they tried to stick me with on a cost, you're talking about $60,000, $70,000 easy. And that was for 4 or 5 legislators. A lot of these task force are 10, 8, 10, way more than 4 or 5. So when you look at the Certificate of Need Task Force, what did they come back with? Needs more study. We need to reform this task force. It needs more study. We can't do anything on it now. It's too complicated. We studied it for months, can't come up with anything. It's too much for us to deal with. And so did they ever vote to reform that Certificate of Need even for this interim here? No, they didn't. So not only did they waste tens of thousands of taxpayer funds to come up with no suggestion, they didn't even reform the committee to build upon the quote-unquote important work that the committee did. Interesting, right? So now we have JCPS coming back and saying, JCPS committee coming back saying, we need to be recreated. Will it be created again and looked into? I don't know. But what I can tell you is it's an embarrassment. You spent tens of thousands of dollars studying this issue, and you have nothing to say about it. You have no suggestions at all. The only thing you've done is eliminate one suggestion. You're giving JCPS an excuse to continue to be an absolute trash heap that's not serving our kids. And that's the other thing. While you're sitting on your butts, not doing anything, not fixing what is the tire fire of our, generally speaking across our state, our public education system, but specifically in this case, JCPS, one of the worst districts in the state, if not the worst, when you look at aggregate performance. You're harming children. More kids are going through this system and they're not learning. They're not doing better. So you may not think it's important, but maybe if you didn't drag your feet so much, this thing that you're confiscating, $25,000, $30,000 per student from the taxpayers to fund can actually start delivering some value to kids. Maybe change a kid's life. I mean, if you're going to take the money from me by force and force me to pay for these school systems. At least you could do is change kids' lives in the process, but instead, you're just going to let them continue to fail. And I think it's pretty sad. It's pretty sad. So Mitch McConnell's seat is up for re-election 2026. And it seems like it's pretty clear he's not going to run. It'd be kind of shocking if he did. He's old as dirt. He stepped down from leadership within the Senate itself. And, quite frankly, that's pretty good signs that he's not going to run again, which means this seat will now be up for re-election. Well, this is being reported by Austin Horn here. Someone thinks 6 prominent Kentucky Republicans could run for the U.S. Senate soon. So various website domains for Senate were recently created for Congressman Andy Barr, Brett Guthrie, James Comer, as well as Daniel Cameron, Kelly Craft, and Lexington businessman Nate Morris. Now, none of them have said whether or not they'll seek the office, and none of them have said that they're involved in the creation of those websites. And there's still no word on whether or not they could even be used in the near term. But at the same time, it's not too uncommon for people to reserve these websites. I mean, I'm just talking as a campaigner. If you get wind that somebody might be looking at running or is going to run, and you're going to run against them, you go around and you buy up these domains. They're incredibly cheap to purchase. I mean, to buy a domain for 2 years might cost you $10, $20 on the high side. On the high side, because these are very niche domains. It's not like you're buying a domain that has a lot of value right now on the market per se. So you go on something like GoDaddy or Google Domains or some other domain buying service, and you're probably purchasing them for somewhere between $5 to $10 a year. And you buy them up because it forces, of course, the individual you could end up running against to go ahead and, one, get a less catchier domain, obviously, if you're trying to, for an example, if I own, let's say, Cooperrider 4KY and someone else owns Cooperrider 4, FORKY, or if I make a website Cooperrider 4KY and to run for office and I put up a website there, then somebody else buys up Cooperrider the number 4KY or something like that, they can redirect that to an attack website. They can set up an attack website on it. They can run ads for it too as well and make it look like it's the other person's website. So that way, when you're searching for it in Google, it comes up. In fact, we did this pretty well in my state treasurer's race to one of the people I was running against, OJ Lika. We purchased domains that were real similar to his actual domain. And we purchased up his last name, Alika, was hard to spell. So we purchased up a bunch of OJ4KYs. And we then ran an attack website on it. And what's funny is when you Googled his name organically, our attack website came up before his. Because one, we had better SEO. Two, it had been up actually longer than his because we were able to launch it pretty much immediately after he declared. And then three, because, more people visited it. It's pushed out there. It was easier to spell. But also because it was purchased sooner too. And that does play a little bit of a role when you're getting into these niche search subjects. And so you'll see this often. So it doesn't mean anybody's running if they're buying up website domains. It just means that somebody thought maybe they would run, so they're going to buy them up. So then if they decide to run, they go ahead and do so. Now, there is something else going on, though, right now that should drag our attention as we're looking at the Senate side of things, and that is that there is a poll going around from somebody who's clearly testing the waters to see if they should go ahead and run for office if they have any name ID. And here is the names that they're asking about. They said, if Senator McConnell's seat becomes open, who would you vote for in the 2026 Republican primary for U.S. Senate? Nate Morris, Andy Barr, Thomas Massey, Daniel Cameron, Kelly Craft, someone else undecided. Now, who would you vote for in 2026 Republican primary for the U.S. Senate between these candidates? Nate Morris, Daniel Cameron, Andy Barr, Kelly Craft, someone else, undecided. Now, it's funny as Thomas Massey dropped off there in that second question. That's kind of interesting. It then goes on to ask them about what issues do they care about, what abortion statement most aligns with your views, when thinking about President Trump, which statement most aligns with your views. And they do that, of course, because they're trying to figure out how to message. They're very inauthentic, these politicians, of course, we know that. And so they focus group test everything. They poll everything. So they want to pick whatever positions and beliefs and stance that they think the majority of primary voters would agree with, so that way they can eke out their positions and be as perfect as they can be for everybody. But it's inauthentic, it's phony, it comes across that way, and of course, everybody's doing this, so it doesn't differentiate you, and that's something to think about too, is that if they ask this question, if everybody polls like, oh, these are my top 3 important issues, this is my how I feel about McConnell, how I feel about Trump, how I feel about this, how I feel about that. And then this candidate makes themselves fit each of those categories. But all the other candidates are doing the same thing. They're all trying to pick the most popular positions. Well, you end up with a bunch of candidates kind of jostling for your vote out of this percentage of, let's say it's, it appeals to 60 or 70% of voters. But then somebody comes along and says, well, there's 4 of you fighting over 60% of the voters. And then I come in and I represent the other 40%. I actually win, representing a minority of the voters' concerns, because you are a bunch of phonies that change everything you can about yourselves in order to just fall in line with whatever you think the voters want you to be based upon your polling. But regardless, we are starting to see this polling, and it makes some sense. I know it seems far away. We're 2 years removed from the general election from that, a year and a half removed from the primary. But here about mid next year, beginning to late summer, you'll probably start seeing some heavy hitters declaring, some people who actually have a chance to win. I'm sure there's people filed for the position now that we don't even know and don't really have a chance to win. It's just a fact of the matter. In order to win office when it's a crowded field, people have to know your name. In order for them to know your name, you got to pay some money to get that name ID. That's just how it works. I don't write the rules, I just follow them. Money wins elections. I can tell you from being in it, money wins elections up until a certain point. Once you have that amount of money, you could possibly win yourself. But you got to build up that name ID. Now, the people who declare early will fall into one of 2 categories. Either they're the kind of people that have tons of money and are not that worried about it. And so I'm thinking of people like Kelly Craft fell into this category, where she had all the money in the world, so it didn't matter. She could declare early, she could spend a lot. During those times, she could campaign hard that entire time, and she could afford to do so. But maybe their name ID is a bit lower, so it's good timing for them. Also, you'll see people who have a little bit of a name ID, will be able to raise some money, but not a whole lot. And so their boots on the ground efforts, their grassroots efforts of getting around as much as they can, meeting as many people as they can, working the crowd as much as they can will be incredibly important for them in order to pull off a win. And they need more time to do that, to win that kind of grassroots style election. So they'll declare early. Now, the people who generally wait later till the last minute are people who want to leave you guessing. It can draw out the media to be like, oh, is this person going to jump in or not? Because once you're declared, they write articles about you being declared. But unless you make some statement that's even slightly controversial or do something noteworthy, they just never mention you again, and so you don't get that much earned media. But if you wait till later, you can continue to get earned media of people speculating on whether or not you're going to run. You'll get mentioned in tons of articles, especially if it seems like you're going to. Then you declare at the last minute, and especially too if you're going to fall into a category, and this is where I think Daniel Cameron fell, Andy Barr would fall, Comer would fall, and that is you're going to have enough to be competitive. You're not going to have the most money out there necessarily, but you will have enough to be competitive. So having that time to go ahead and run, having that time you don't necessarily need, because people kind of know your name already. You've got pretty good name ID. You won't need to do as much grassroots work to get your name out there, to win people over. You've already won over a lot of people through current office holding, while at the same time, you're not going to struggle to fundraise. Because that's the other thing too. If you're somebody who can raise the money, but it's going to take you time to do it, you need more time running to raise the millions of dollars compared to somebody who maybe knows they can raise $3-5 million, whatever they're going to raise for this primary, and they can do it in a reasonable amount of time. They'll wait till later. So, it's just where different candidates fall in different categories. Nobody's going to be able to declare, though, and scare people off, I don't think, but we could know. And there's people on that list, too, that you probably don't know. The one making onto the list the most, it probably is coming from his camp, I would say, is Nate Morris. And I'm only saying that because that is not a household name yet. Most of you listening to this probably don't even know who Nate Morris is. He's kind of amongst the politicos talked about person. He was the founder of Rubicon, a waste management company. But, there's some issues there because I know that Rubicon went through a bankruptcy. I believe with him at the helm too. And so that doesn't look too well. Now, granted, Donald Trump had bankruptcy, right? But at the same time, it was delisted actually from the stock market in June of 2024, actually. So that's pretty interesting. And so, it happens. You run a business badly. Now, the problem that Nate's going to have, and I'm saying this as somebody who just knows, is that Rubicon, while going through that, going through bankruptcy and everything else, burned some bridges in the state and burned some bridges at least locally in Lexington too, because they didn't pay their bills. They had people who did work for them for months, and then they didn't pay them and owe them thousands of dollars and still haven't paid them. And then, he's going to come in and probably spend $100,000-200,000 at least, if not more, of his own money on a Senate race, owing thousands of dollars to contractors out there. And I think that's going to come back to haunt them in ways that I think they don't expect. And I'm saying this because I know some of the people that own these companies, and I know in which it can spiral out of control for him pretty quick. And probably what's sad is Nate will probably not even realize why he's getting so much pushback in some of these categories. Because he won't realize that it's because I owe people money. But anyways, that's I think that's who's probably pushing it out there. Because if you're polling if you're Thomas Massey polling, you left yourself off on the second round of questions. That's kind of interesting. It could be Kelly Craft polling as well. Kelly Craft, obviously, they kind of live in Lexington there, and so I know they live in a couple different places, but Lexington is a place they live. They would be more familiar with Nate Morris too as well in the conversation about him running. But Comer's not on there on that list. That could point to Comer not running, of course, and that could point to if it is Kelly Craft who's doing that polling right now, because there's a little backstory. Comer and Kelly Craft and the Crafts in general are pretty close. Crafts are pretty big donors behind the Comer campaign. You may remember Comer coming out and endorsing Kelly Craft during the election because Kelly Craft is just a big donor to Comer, and obviously if you give them a lot of money, you become friends. So the fact Comer's being left off could indicate that they know Comer's not going to run because, Kelly Craft's going to run. And Kelly Craft's a big donor to Comer. And so Comer's going to have to go up, you lose your spot in Congress. And then also you're going to have to go up against your donors and the people who have been giving money to you. And so if you can't run, if you can't get money in, so I think that does indicate that Comer's not going to run. And I think possibly, as I'm saying this, I'm realizing that poll might have came out of the Craft camp. We'll see. But, y'all, that's what I got time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Thank you all so much for joining me. See you back here later this week. Hope you have a great rest of your day.